in the state of Florida, and I reside in Miami, Florida. So people can find me. The name of my company is Advocate to Create, and the two is the number two. I truly believe in advocacy. So I really wanted to make sure that, I think through mental health, we're able to help our clients learn to advocate for themselves, which I think is awesome. So Advocate to Create. I also have an Advocate to Create teachable.com, which is a place where I have different workshops or trainings for mental health, being either for therapists and clinicians or just the community at large.
So if I pronounce your name, your full name correctly, I'm going to cheat a little bit here. So it's Dr. Patricia Timerman Barboso da Silva.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And what's my prize for pronouncing it
Oh my
correctly?
God. Like that's what make what I say, like ding ding dings. Like it's not this. You got yeah, no, I used to be just Patricia Timerman for 33 years of my life. And then Barbosa da Silva came later. And it people just mess up that name. It is so funny. Like you get so many different variations of the name. And my name is not even as long as my husband's. So I
So he has the longer name.
oh yes. Oh yes. And he's proud of it. And I'm like, I was mine was so easy. It was just two names. Um, but even for communication, so here we are gonna talk a little bit about like communication and just names and knowing like when you see Patricia Timerman, you're like, okay, where is she from? It's not that like difficult to say. When you say Barbosa da Silva, it's like, okay, she's Brazilian, right? Like names can tell so much about a person, about their culture, about their nationality, their race. Like names can be very unique, and it communicates so much.
I agree. I agree. Like when people hear my name, Terrain, because I'm in Toronto, Canada, and my background, like I was born in the French part of Canada.
Okay.
So when people hear the name Terrain, they're like, oh, Terrain. Like, oh, you're French. So like it gives it right away. So you're absolutely right. And I wonder why that is because my parents are Jamaican, but it's like they decided when they came over to Canada and then their firstborn, which is me, when they picked a name, it just so happened to be a French name, even though their background has nothing to do with
So it's
French.
interesting. Yeah. And in Brazil, it is very usual for people to have middle names. But my brother, my sister, and I, we don't. It's just Patricia Timerman. And then my little brother from my dad, my parents got divorced when I was really young. So my dad had my little brother with my stepmom, and he also is just first last name. And I noticed that in my family, maybe because we have an European background, um, I don't know if in Europe it's used to having two names or not, but I know in Brazil, most people usually ask me, like, so what's your middle name? I'm like, I don't have one. Um, to them was weird, but to me, it was just how I grew up. So it wasn't.
Do you have like a nickname, like a name that people would call you?
God, I have so many depending on who's talking to me. Um, my really like one of my best friends calls me P time because one we were actually as I was doing the book and editing the book, the person had like Patricia Timerman, so P time was my the name there. So she saw that and she couldn't help herself. My dad calls me Pachuca or Pachulachu, again very Brazilian. My siblings call me Kihale, Ki for short, and that is Yiddish because there was a song that I used to hate growing up that my grandma used to sing that says Pachi Kihale. And so they used to call me this. I have many different names. How about you?
I do. So because I asked that question because I've noticed a lot of people who don't have middle names, they usually have like a secondary name that like people just adopt, right? And you've had like 500 of them. So for me, my nickname is, and this has been like very, very young, has always been like chameleon, right? And the reason for that is, well, I think, anyways, anytime I went to school or if I went to an event, it was always outside of where I lived, which is kind of like lower middle class or poor neighborhood, but I
Okay.
was always able to fit in. So I would go to the better schools, I go to the better events, right? Even though when I came back home, it was like the ghetto or the poor, right? So like, oh, you fit in like a chameleon, and then it just
Yeah, I love
stuff.
that.
All
I think
these.
my husband is like that. Like he's like
Mm.
he'll get along with anybody, no matter who it is. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful like trait. Is that what's called? Yeah, trait to have.
Yeah. No, oh my God, 100%. Um, but we're talking about like names and then communication, what it tells about you. And I was wondering because you said, your parents are Jamaican and moved to Canada. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay.
The French side of Canada, of all places.
The French side of okay. So how do you identify? Like, do you identify by the culture that your parents had at home, or were they more like Canadian culture? How do you identify?
Well, I because I was raised by my grandmother, I didn't know my parents until I was about 5 years old.
Okay.
So when I was born, it was in the French side. So my grandmother was there. So I was raised around it. So that's what I knew. Like obviously, like when I looked at my grandmother, I was like, okay, no, she's not from this area, right? So growing up and like being around the people there, I didn't realize how much I adopted that side until I started to go to school. And
Okay.
then when people started hearing me speak, they're like, oh, you have like that accent, like in the way I pronounce my words. But to me, it was just normal, right? Because everyone in my house had the same accent, right? Because they were there so long themselves. So when I met my parents, and then I was like, oh, okay, there's this whole Jamaican side, and the way they speak is totally different, right?
Really? Okay.
So that's where I had like, okay, this is my background, but I only know of this. So that's how I identified, right? Because growing up, everyone told me you have this accent, you have this, you have that. So I just said, okay. So I kind of didn't like it as a kid, but now as an adult, I love it because it kind of makes me unique.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. I don't know. Okay, I have a rule in therapy, which is whenever something comes to my mind, it comes out through my mouth. So I'm gonna apply this rule here because something came to my mind, so it's gonna come out through my mouth. But when you said, like something that I had, like the people would tell me that I have an accent that I hated, but now it's something that like I love and I find it unique. So I don't look Brazilian, right? Like when you think Brazilian, you don't think this, I would assume. Um, and to me, I remember I hated my freckles. I hated it with a passion and how white I am. Like I've always stood out. I am super white. Like my skin, like again, in Brazil growing up, um, if I was always, I would stand out no matter where I was. And I really disliked it for a long time. I used to be called like Casper or like growing up, people tease you about your differences. I think that if I was growing up today, things are a lot more difficult as opposed to back then where there were no phones. There was like, it didn't follow you. Um, but I today it's something that I've learned to love about myself is my skin color and my freckles because it's something that I really grew up um, having a really difficult relationship with.
Same. Absolutely the same because it made me back then I probably thought it made me stand out in all the wrong ways, but now it's kind of like unique in a lot of ways, right? Like when I like if I were to pull up like a stereotypical picture of a Brazilian or a Jamaican, we probably didn't look like that when we were growing up. I didn't have the dreads, which I have now. I didn't have the beard, which I had now. And you mentioned you had freckles. Like, I don't think if you're to ask 100 people saying that, oh, do you know Brazilians have freckles? They'll be like, oh, really? Well, online, I see them shaped this way. I see them very tanned. And when they think of like someone with a Jamaican culture, like if I had to tell you I had curly hair when I was growing up, they're like, really? Usually when I see Jamaicans, they have like the full beard, they have the dreads, they have the Jamaican hat. So it's interesting to see how much stereotypes plays in our childhood and impacts us.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that I love about kind of going a little bit into the the model that I developed, and I call it intention, action, perception, which is what this book is about. But part of it is so. Let me do a mini TED talk on this. I'm just kidding. Like intention is internal to us. Only we know our intentions, right? That's part of the premise of it. Perception is also internal to us or to the person who's observing or receiving the action. The only external thing is the action itself. But you were talking to me about the lens through which you grew up, even not knowing that people sounded different until you went somewhere else. Because to you, like, what do you mean I have an accent? Everybody sounds like me in my household. So our perception is shaped by our worldview, by how we grew up, by the way that we interact with the world and the world interacts with us. And each of us have had a different experience of the world based on our skin color, our ethnicity, our religion, our sexual orientation, gender identity, right? Everything. So all of those impact our perceptions. And one of the things that I noticed that kind of brought up this model is how we believe that the way that we perceive the world is obviously the way that everybody else perceives the world. And it's not until we start understanding these differences that we're like, oh, okay, that's why my actions got lost in translation. Like, wow, dude. Right? But up to that point, you think that, the expression actions speak louder than words. The frustration that I have is that the implication of that statement is that all actions are universal or have a universal meaning, and they don't. It really depends on our background and our perception of the world.
Why do you think we struggle with that as children, but then maybe we struggle to understand that as adults?
Because to us, I think growing up, like that, this is the way, right? So I can't fathom that there's a different way of seeing things that everybody around me does. If everybody in my family does things this way, then of course everybody in the world experiences things in the same way. So I think it's just ingrained in our mind that our way of thinking is the way of thinking. And it's not until we open our minds up to identify that there are other ways of seeing the same thing that then we welcome it more. Does that make sense?
It does, because it reminds me of a situation where I didn't know I was poor until someone told me I was poor.
Okay.
Right? Because I didn't go without when I was growing up as a child, right? Like my grandmother did the best that she could. And to me, if someone didn't tell me this wasn't my mother, why would I believe this not my mother? Because she's always there, right?
Yeah.
So when someone told me, they're like, "Hey, where's your mom and dad?" and they pointed to their mom and dad, that's where I saw an age difference. I was like, "Oh, okay, the person that's my mother is looks like she's older, but you still don't understand because you're a child, but you can observe it." And then when I would go back to the apartment, and then looking back, I was like, "Yeah, okay, I didn't have this, I didn't have that." But that's me looking back. When I was going through it, it wasn't like I was sitting there saying that, why don't I have a car? Why don't I have this type of dinner? Why don't I have that? I was still being taken care of. So I think you're absolutely right. Like you don't know what you don't have until someone points out what you don't have.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. Or even what you have.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like if you have like I'll use like you and your husband, like if you have like a marriage, right? Or if it's like a good marriage, or if it's something else, someone's like, yeah, you know what? Your husband, your wife, they're pretty good people. Where you're looking at it as maybe because sometimes you're in it for so long, you're like, yeah, this is my person. But they're highlighting things that if you could, because I remember someone was pointing out something that when I was that my girlfriend does, and I sat back, I was like, yeah, I remember when that was like new to me, and when that was like it meant so much more. But now it's like a part of a relationship where maybe someone else who's going without it, they're like, I wish I can talk to my partner about this, and I wish I can talk to my partner about that. And I'm surprised how many people don't have communications with the person they're in a relationship with.
Yeah. Again, that's the reason that I did this. Right? Is it's really so I tell my husband, I've been with my husband for 12 years now. And I've had long-term relationships in the past. And I've had, good and bad. But one of the things that I've noticed is that the negative aspects of past relationships have allowed me to understand who is the partner I did not want to be. Right. And it became less about who is the partner that I want to have and more about who do I want to be in the relationship. And one of the things that's happened in past relationships was me walking on eggshells. And I'm like, I don't want to walk on eggshells again. Right? I want to be able to talk, to communicate. And I had a supervisor, right, during my, after your master's, you do like 2 years of supervision. I absolutely love her, Dr. Sylvia Reyes. And she would always tell me that she loved when things went wrong, because that's when you really learn. That's when like it is engraved in your mind. And I'm like, it's true, because like the negative aspects of past relationships have really stood out and I've learned from it, right? What I don't want in a relationship. And it was from my marriage that I started realizing that his way of thinking was different from my way of thinking. And it's not that he was wrong and I was right, or he was right and I was wrong. It's just that the two of us looked at it in such distinct ways that we couldn't understand each other. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So tell me more. So when that was going on in your relationship, what was the impact to maybe the both of you individually and as a couple?
So I can give an example, right? Like I think one of the first ones that kind of started the concept of the IAP, of the intention, action, perception. There was this fight that we had, and I remember distinctly that day in the apartment. We had moved in together. We were living together just for a little bit, and we had a fight. And after that fight, I left the room. Now my thinking was, I'm leaving the room. You asked better follow me to show me that you care. He didn't follow me. Ergo, he did not care, right? That was my thought. You did not follow me. You don't care. And then he heard me like getting really infuriated outside, like outside the room. He went outside, we got a little matter, and then we kind of cooled down. And then I asked him, like, why did you not follow? And he said, you created space. And if I had created space, I would have wanted you to respect that. So in respecting you, I didn't follow you. And I was like, oh, okay, that not how I saw it at all. So then one of the things that we learned from that event is, if he leaves, I stay. If I leave, he follows. But there were little things like that that allowed me to see how he sees things differently, and allow him to see how I see things differently. And then we are better able to work accordingly, if that makes any sense. Or even if I'm able to say, hey, I really disliked when I saw this happening. Can you let me know what your intention was? Because this is how I saw it. And being able to kind of talk like that with each other is, I'm letting you, instead of being reactive to what I see, which sometimes I am, I'm human and we all are, but the majority of the times we kind of pause ourselves and I'm like, hey, what was your intention behind this? Because the way that I received it was really negative and I didn't like it. Right. So the other person is able to clear things up or say, no, that was my intention because I was mad at you. Does that make sense?
It does. It does, because it reminds me of a situation where I had where the communication unfortunately wasn't as refined as
Okay.
what you described. Right. So this person, unfortunately, and if you're watching, I apologize because I know that you do, because she's an ex. She leads with sex. So when she's trying to resolve something, she resolves it through sex.
Okay.
That's her thing. Me, on the other hand, I don't resolve situations like that. I'm a communicator. It could be because of my training, my experience, things like that. So when you're trying to when you when you're trying to emotionally connect with someone that can only sexually connect with you, it's going to
Mhm.
butt heads. So when, and no one likes being rejected. So when someone's offering their body to you to kind of resolve the situation, you're like, hold up, not right now because I'm not in the mood. How about we have this conversation? Now you have a whole different type of fight, right? Because now
Uh,
you're rejecting the person that is causing you to be upset. So what I did is I had to communicate to her saying that it's not you in regards to what you're offering, it's at this point in time is not the most appropriate way to try to resolve that. Unfortunately for this person, she would shut down because that's all that she knew and that was her baseline. So it was tough. And I remember a direct quote she told me. This was like after we broke up. She was like, Terrain, men don't reject women. Women reject men.
Okay.
That's exactly what I said. And you know, when someone is upset at you, when you say the words okay, what happens? They get more mad. But the relationship was over at this point, right? Like she was offering something else, which was that. But it's tough. I sometimes I feel bad because it's tough for people who resolve the issue one way and they're not able to see the other side. So what would you like tell those who struggle to say that there's more than who struggle to understand there's more than one way to resolve an issue, and if you're unable to at least see the other person's perspective, there may be future problems as well.
That's fair, and I appreciate that question, right? Because we have defense mechanisms. Again, going back to the concept of our perception and the meaning that we associate to things, and uh, sex, for example, right? And learning that that is a way to pause a fight, or something to be used in that way. So it becomes like a defense mechanism that we use to certain triggers. One of the coping skills that I've developed, so in this book, which I call it "Why Are We Fighting?" Right? I The first two chapters are on the theory, but chapter three is all about coping skills, and they're both strategies for the person communicating and for the person receiving the communication. So the one I'm going to talk about is for the person receiving the communication. In this case, I call it the rule of three interpretations. In this rule, I ask the person who's receiving the information to identify what is a fact, what is something that is known,